Okay, good evening. Our first speaker is Kevin Anderson. Kevin is a Professor of Energy and Climate Change at the University of Manchester and also former Director of the Tyndall Centre for Climate Research here in Manchester. So please welcome Kevin Anderson.
My name is Kevin Anderson. I work at Manchester University, and I should say for my sins that I used to work in the oil industry, so design and build offshore oil platforms, so I have a background in working in oil. The talk today is quite a whistle-stop tour, really, from this whole language of net zero by 2050, which hopefully you're all familiar with, and hopefully your eyes roll when you ever hear it, to real zero for 1.5 degrees centigrade of warming. And I've recently sent up with a colleague of mine, Dan Calverley, a website, a YouTube, and we're doing podcasts at the moment called Climate Uncensored. So there's quite a lot of information on that site now. It's only really recently gone online, and indeed this afternoon we put our first YouTube interview with Greta Thunberg. So there's a discussion between Greta and myself, which some of you might find quite interesting, going on this idea that people you wouldn't expect can change the dialogue. A 15-year-old schoolgirl who would expect to change the dialogue on climate change, but she did. So I'm going to start off with a bit of science. It sounds slightly flippant. I should say I gave this talk, almost identical talk, to the Home Office this morning. The climate does not respond to good intentions, to Machiavellian policies, to eloquent arguments, legal niceties, or accountancy scams. And in that include net zero. Now I say that because that's what we've been doing for decades, at least 2 decades, if not nearer 3 decades now. All of this is trumped by the brutal beauty of the physics. What matters in terms of temperature is the total amount of CO2 we dump in the atmosphere and the other greenhouse gases. That's what brings about temperature rise, which brings about the impacts. And the reason we don't like talking about that is because that has immediate implications in terms of policy. So the Paris Agreement, I'm going to take it you're all at least moderately familiar with this, was about aiming to stay well below 2, and ideally 1.5 in accordance with science, and equity. Equity being an absolutely key part of the climate negotiations going right back to 1992 and something called the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. So every international agreement embeds equity as a key part, but it's ignored completely by the rich countries. Now the focus I want to put on here is 1.5 and 2 degrees centigrade. So 1.5 and equity rather than 2 degrees. I'll point out why in a minute. After the Paris Agreement, and this idea of staying below 1.5, the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, were asked to look at this at 1.5. And they produced a special report in 2018. And they summarise it in one sort of line, really. It's the impacts of 1.5 are severe. This is not a safe threshold. They'll be disastrous for many ecosystems, human systems, physical infrastructure, and so forth. More floods, more droughts, more extinctions, more human migration, more misery, more suffering. And they're considerably worse at 2 degrees. So what was really important in this 1.5 framing is we started to understand that just a fraction of a degree can make a very large difference in terms of impacts to human and ecosystems. That's a really important part or outcome of the Paris Agreement. And that led to a whole series of emergency declarations by in this case by the UK, various devolved administrations, but also, of course, across the world, including some companies and so forth. And then we had the COP26. This is Patrick Vallance, the government's chief scientist, saying that it is crucial we stay to 1.5 degrees centigrade. It is not a negotiable thing. So, it's not a radical left-wing view. This is standard view of the science, and as I say, the UK government chief scientific officer. Now, there's a couple of quotes here taken from the opening day of Glasgow, the COP, and reported in UN News. They stopped counting the death toll when it reached 6,000, but there are still 1,600 people bodies still missing. Massive floods, devastating wildfires, rising seas, alongside with countless lives they take and livelihoods they upend, are realities many nations are facing. So that's the sort of anecdotal evidence that was discussed and opened really the COP process. And it's easy to say, well, it's just anecdotal. What does that matter? Well, okay, IPCC, if you like the science, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, Working Group 2 on impacts, at 1.1 degrees centigrade of warming, and we're slightly above that now, nearing 1.2 degrees centigrade of warming, we're already seeing increasing weather and extreme events that have exposed millions, have exposed millions of people to acute food insecurity and reduced water security. In all regions, extreme heat events have resulted in human mortality and morbidity. We are already killing people with the emissions we have knowingly put into the atmosphere over the last 20 or 30 years. And it is really clear if you read the whole section on the impacts that we're seeing so far in that report. So we've got real clear evidence that the 1.5 is a dangerous threshold, but probably the best that we can get to. So what are we doing about it? What are we doing to reduce our emissions, mitigation? Well, my generation, I would say people with no hair, grey hair or dyed hair, need some significant humility on this. This is the first IPCC report. Now, the students, I'm told, normally if I've got students there, I know they weren't born and their parents probably hadn't met. Some of you were probably around, I think, in 1990, but other ones weren't. So we've known everything we needed to know about climate change to respond to it since 1990, over a third of, well, around about a third of a century ago. And yet the emissions this year, last year, were over 60% higher than they were in 1990, and they are still going up. So let's be absolutely clear. People like me and other people around the world that have tried to feed into this process have fundamentally failed. Profound failure on climate change for a third of a century. Now we have to recognise that. We may have tried hard, but we have failed. And it's the worst sort of failure. I mean, emissions have gone up, not come down. But of course, every country is showing leadership, so it's hard to believe that can actually be the case globally, because every country is a winner on this. Of course, the wonderful UK Brexit writing. Emissions in 2020 were 51% lower than they were in 1990. That's what we've been told by the Committee on Climate Change and by the government. But that happens to exclude international aviation and shipping. And interestingly, the climate doesn't exclude those emissions, it still sees them. And it also excludes our imports and exports. Factor those in, and we've seen about a 15% reduction since 1990. So that's about 0.5% reduction every single year, primarily through the shift from coal to gas. Now, that's not good for the UK. There are no progressive countries out there on climate change. Denmark, Sweden, France, the EU as a region, they all like to think they're doing something on climate change. Look at their total emissions, and there's virtually been no change since 1990. So there are no progressive leaders on climate change at the national level. And the whole lie, and I think it's a fair, in my view, I think it's a fair but slightly provocative framing of net zero, but the whole lie of it is reinforced here by the UK now, encouraging airport expansion, £27 billion on new roads, potentially opening a new coal mine, our new Prime Minister's enthusiasm for ever more oil and gas fields, and now we're looking at opening up fracking yet again. Now, all of these are carbon profligate developments and all fit within net zero 2050. The only one that's probably going to be questioned by the Committee on Climate Change, and has been a little bit, is the coal mine. But the rest of them, they won't come out and say that's not compatible. They are all incompatible with 1.5 degrees centigrade. So what does the IPCC, what does the sort of collection of the scientific evidence tell us about 1.5 degrees centigrade and mitigation, if at all it is in any way possible? Well, if you take the collection of reports, and I'll summarise them, pages and pages of work here, in one key sort of phrase. It's the carbon budget that matters, the total amount of carbon dioxide we dump in the atmosphere. That's the key factor. It's not long-term targets, not 2045, 2050, even 2030. They don't link to temperature, it's the total amount of CO2 we put in the atmosphere. And if we look at the latest report from the IPCC, that just came out last year, you get loads of tables like this. Now, you don't have to worry about the numbers in detail, I'll touch them on in a minute, but if you want 1.5 degrees centigrade of warming, and you're starting from 2020, which is when this table is from, it tells you how much CO2 you can dump in the atmosphere for a given chance of a particular temperature rise of 1.5. So if you want an outside chance, you've got 650 billion tonnes, a 50-50 chance, 500 billion tonnes, and a slightly better chance, 400 billion tonnes. So the less you put in, the better the chance of staying at 1.5. Those numbers, unless you're a sort of a climate geek, don't mean very much to many people, but I'll come back to them in a bit more detail now. So, the remaining budget, remember that's from 2020, we're now in 2022. The remaining budget from now is about 400 billion tonnes for a 50-50 chance of 1.5 degrees centigrade. That's about 9.5 years of current global emissions. And remember, emissions are not going down, they're going up at the moment. So about 9.5 years. We're using the budget up for 50% chance of 1.5 at 1%, around about 1%, every single month. Every month. So this year we've already used up around about 8% of the budget for 1.5 degrees centigrade. And yet what we hear, repeats, so I say it's 1% squandered every month. What we hear relative to 1.5 and 2 is net zero 2050 and all the other ubiquitous nonsense around that. What on earth has that got to do with 1.5 degrees centigrade? Nothing is what it has to do with it, other than political delay. And the academic community takes some significant responsibility for not questioning that whole framing. But that's at the global level. And we are committed repeatedly to sign up on the basis of equity. So I assume our policymakers aren't lying when they sign up for these commitments. So I hold them to account. So for a reasonable chance of staying below 1.5 degrees centigrade, and some of you may not see this, but you see a couple of big curves. An orange one, which is the developing countries. I don't like that term, but that's the language that's used in the Paris Agreement. So it's the developing country parties. This is where 80% of the world's population live. And the blue one, where 20% of the world's population live, or 18% actually, I think, and the so-called developed countries. And if you look at the zero date on here, some of you are going to see that, that's about 2031. Zero emissions, this is principally from fossil fuels, by about 2031. Quite a different prospect to net zero, which isn't zero really, if you look at the actual spreadsheets behind it, by 2050. So then, what's the slice that we get in the UK of that developed country pie? Well, for a 50% chance of 1.5, I've sort of simplified a lot of the stuff behind this just to get it a bit quicker. We've got a budget of about 1.7 billion tonnes for the UK. That's 4 years of current emissions. 4 years of current emissions, and we blow through our fair part of a 50% chance of 1.5 budget. Where 1.5, remember, is not a safe threshold. Many people will die. They'll be poor, low emitters, a long way from here, and typically people of colour. And we've known that for a long time. That's about a 20% per annum reduction in emissions at a national level. And within that, of course, the wealthy would have to do a lot more than the poor people. That's zero emissions to say by about 2030, 2031 for an outside, for a 50-50 chance of 1.5. If you go for a well below 2 degrees centigrade framing of Paris, that comes about 2039. So we have a bit longer, but that's not much longer, but the impacts, of course, are much worse. Put simply, this is profound system change. It wouldn't have been profound if we started in 1990, it would have been less profound if we started in 2000, but we've waited until 2022 and we're still failing. So why is this so different to the rhetorical nonsense that dominates academia, journalism, the major reports that come out on what we should do about climate change? This net zero framing by 2045 for Scotland, 2050 for the UK or the US, 2070 for India. I think it's 2070 for India. But firstly, the net zero framing is new. It wasn't there a few years ago. The Committee on Climate Change, the guiding body for the government's own advisory committee, in its 2015 report, didn't mention net zero once. In its 2020 report, it was mentioned between 3,000 and 5,000 times. That is the same for the IPCC. If you look at their last report and compare it with the new report, you see this rapid shift, this language of net zero. Now, I want to try and unpick this a bit, but it's quite difficult to do quickly, but I'll try and just touch on it here. One of the real dangers of net zero, it allows substitution between things. And, unscrupulous people love substitution because it allows you to move things somewhere else. And that's the danger with it. So it allows us to move between gases. It allows us to say, well, we'll not emit quite as much methane, but that allows us to emit a bit more carbon dioxide. These have completely different sort of impacts in the atmosphere. They last different amounts of time, lots of different issues about certainty and so forth around them. It allows us to think about different sources. So you can compare emissions from a car, CO2 from a car, compared with agricultural emissions from fertiliser. They're different gases in completely different, from different sources with completely different levels of certainty. And it allows you to spread them over time. So you can compare CO2 from a flight we take today with CO2 that's captured in the tree in 2070. It allows you to pass it across time as well. A tonne is a tonne is a tonne in this new accountancy scam called net zero. But these things have different chemistries, different atmospheric times in the atmosphere, lifetimes in the atmosphere, different levels of certainty and risk. So that's a really dangerous thing. So it allows accountants to move things on the spreadsheet, make it look like you're doing something when you're not. It also relies very heavily on something called carbon dioxide removal. It changes its name every few years as to what it is. But basically it's sucking the CO2 out of the atmosphere in the future, a long time from now usually. Two main parts to that. One's called negative emission technologies, which sound like you can actually buy these on the shelves, but they're not actually available other than very small pilot schemes. And the nice woolly term, nature-based solutions, which is basically the industrialisation of our landscape. And just to put a sense how important this is in the scenarios, virtually every single IPCC scenario at a global level, and in that include national ones for people like the UK, include massive quantities of negative emission technologies. hundreds, and then literally if you look at the numbers in these scenarios, you're talking of hundreds of billions of tons of CO2 will be sucked out of the atmosphere, our CO2, sucked out of the atmosphere by our children and our children's children after 2050, most of it, and indeed after 2100. So almost without exception, the scenarios all include an industry that does not exist today, just a few pilot schemes, but it's roughly the same size in every scenario, a few of them, as the current oil and gas industry, global oil and gas industry. And that's fine if it's 5% of the scenarios. When it's 99% of the scenarios, it's a systemic bias. Remember, these don't exist at scale today. My position on carbon dioxide removal, yes, let's fund the research on it. Let's deploy it if it meets very stringent sustainability criteria, ecological and social. We can't just buy up the land for poor parts of the world because they don't have any money. They have indigenous rights to that land, so we have to think about that as well. But let's reduce our emissions, assuming that carbon dioxide removal will not work at scale, because it probably will not do. And most of the modelers away from a microphone will tell you exactly that. But we will require some carbon dioxide removal, because you cannot eliminate all of the emissions from agriculture. Even if we all went vegan and we had no-till agriculture, you're still going to emit some emissions from agriculture. So you have to have some CDR, some carbon dioxide removal, which means energy needs to be real zero, not net zero. And it's also seen as a policy framework for all. This is what people think is really beneficial about net zero. But for me, that vagueness undermines the need to rapidly move away from fossil fuels. These companies, these well-known carers of the environment, all of these are signed up to net zero by 2050. All the oil companies. None of them are going to go to zero emissions by 2050. Look at their plans, there's no intention to be. So usually it's about, we will get the oil out of the ground by using renewable power to get the oil out of the ground. You look at people like Equinor are now looking to expand into the Arctic as well. So don't be taken in by the oil companies. But don't worry, because these countries here have all got net zero by 2050, and every one of those countries or regions is also looking to develop, at this moment, more oil and gas fields, even though we can't burn about 2/3 of the gas and oil that we already know in the existing fields. So it's just one massive scam for all these people together. So I think net zero has been incredibly dangerous and is not questioned enough by the academics or the NGO community for that matter. I'll just touch on this in the end and then I'll finish. Regardless of your moral or political position, if you think 1.5 is important, or indeed 2 degrees centigrade, and you think the science also tells us something worthwhile, then that equation equals equity. There's no way out of that. I'm an engineer and I think you can do a lot with engineering. It's a prerequisite of resolving climate change, but it's not sufficient. Equity is key. Half of the world's CO2 comes from just 10% of the world's population. And a much more damning figure than that, which came out from Stephen Carter's work last year, the top 1% of global emitters have a combined carbon footprint that's twice as big as the bottom half of the world's population. It just shows you how emissions are massively skewed to few people. A quick thought experiment, imagine we actually thought this was a climate emergency, and we asked the top 10, we required by regulations the top 10% of the world's emitters to cut their emissions to the level of the average European. So not too low the screen. And the other 90% of the world's population make no change. That's a 1/3 cut in global CO2, just from the top 10%. If you look at all the pledges made in Paris about climate change, they come to virtually no change by 2030. If this was a climate emergency, you could do that in a year. You'd probably do it in 6 months. That's not enough, but it's a hell of a start, and it shows you how the emissions are skewed to the people who colour the debate, the professors, the journalists, all the academic community working on climate change, the policymakers, the entrepreneurs, all the people who set the debate on climate change are all in the 1% group, or aspiring to be there. And that's why we don't ever talk about equity. And don't be taken in by means. When you look at averages, means are very misleading. UK household income, this is household, not individuals, which links very closely to emissions. The mean is £37,000 a year for households. The median is £30,000, and the mode, the most common level, is £23,000. You won't get an academic out of bed for £37,000 a year. And so bear in mind these numbers. They're really important about who are the people, even in rich countries, actually who are the low emitters. So to conclude, the headline choice for the UK, or indeed any developed country, is if we want to ignore international equity, which is what we've done so far, passing the massive burden of climate change to our children and reneging our international agreements, but that does dovetail very nicely with today's politics, particularly today's politics, and it maintains the market model. Then 5% mitigation rates, 5% cuts every year, and net zero by 2050, and just hope our children will give us. Alternatively, if you take international equity seriously, then we need a massive mitigation effort by this generation, We need to cut emissions in line with 1.5 and abide by our agreements in Paris and Glasgow. That's a massive ramp up in government leadership, not just central government, but also local government and so forth. A reshaping of mainstream economics. We've actually seen that really since the banking crisis right through to now and post-COVID. So we haven't really had mainstream market economics since about 2007, really. And it needs to have equity at its core, and that's going to give you something like 15 to 20% per annum mitigation rates and real zero from energy by about 2030 to 2035. In 2022, as Einstein noted, or was attributed to him, insanity is doing the same thing over and over again. We're expecting a different result, and we've spent the last 32 years passing on such insanity to our children, and net zero is the latest incarnation of this ruse. So, on that note, thanks for listening, and that's the website to some of the work that we've got that might be helpful to think about some of the issues on climate change.
Thank you very much, Kevin Anderson, ladies and gentlemen. Okay, our second speaker this evening is Bill McGuire. He's the Professor Emeritus of Geophysical and Climate Hazards at University College London, and also the author of Hothouse Earth, An Inhabitant's Guide. So please give a big Manchester welcome for Bill McGuire.
Talk about the same thing as Kevin, only with a little bit of a different slant. Hothouse Earth was based upon one premise, really, and that is that keeping the global average temperature rise below 1.5 degrees is practically impossible. We can't sidestep, therefore, dangerous, all-pervasive climate breakdown. And as a result of that, we must adapt to new conditions at the same time as slashing emissions as soon as possible to avoid dangerous becoming cataclysmic. All my talks are this optimistic. There's a lot on here, but really it just summarises the sort of impossibility and impracticability that Kevin's been talking about. You can see past human emissions, you can see the sort of drop that's needed to keep within the 1.5 degrees C, what's sometimes called dangerous climate change guardrail, and that's simply not going to happen in the real world. And there are other issues here as well. One of them is that 1.5 degrees is an arbitrary figure in terms of where we start meeting dangerous climate breakdown. It could be 1.4, it could be 1.6. 33 million people displaced in Pakistan might say we're already there. So, you know, that in that sense, linking 1.5 to this so-called idea of dangerous climate change is not really valid. And the point is, again, that Kevin made, every 0.1 degrees C, even less than that, is equally important. So, you know, we keep the temperature rise as low as we possibly can. Unfortunately, that's not really happening at the moment. Now I'm going to go back in time a little bit and put our current warming in context. This shows the global temperature curve for the last 10,000 years. And you can see that for the last few thousand, we've been heading down. We've been heading down into the next ice age. So we should be somewhere down the bottom there on the right-hand side. But you can see from the red that things have changed rather a lot due to human interference. And we're now going in the opposite direction. In fact, we may have, the next few ice ages may actually have been cancelled as a result of our polluting activities. If we go back further, we can get some idea of where we might be headed in terms of our climate. Of course, we can model the climate and see what that tells us, but we can also look back in the past to periods when conditions have been very similar. And the earliest of those conditions is the last interglacial, a time known as the Eemian. Temperatures were comparable to where they are today. Carbon dioxide levels look as if they were slightly lower. Sea level was 6 to 9 meters higher. So that gives us a little bit of a clue as to where we might be going. If we go back further in time, the picture looks even worse. This is a temperature curve going from something like 65 million years ago, from when the dinosaurs became extinct, to the present day. And there are a number of peaks on here. One of these is known as the Paleocene. Oops, sorry. The Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum, which is an incredible temperature spike. But this time you had crocodiles in the Arctic Ocean, you had palm trees in Siberia. If we come a little bit nearer to our own time, we have something called the Middle Miocene climate optimum. Again, this time, conditions were very similar to what they are now. Similar carbon dioxide levels, but sea level was 20 meters higher. So again, that gives us some idea of where we might be heading. Now, the worrying thing, the really worrying thing, is that the temperature rises here, in both cases, happened over periods of thousands of years. So although they look incredibly rapid on the scale, on the geological time scale, they took place over tens of thousands of years. We're now seeing these sorts of changes occurring over a period of hundreds of years. So it may well be possible that the temperature of the planet has never gone up so quickly in such a short period of time in the whole of our planet's 4.6 billion year history. So what we're doing is totally unprecedented. Now, we all talk about the global average temperature rise, but that hides a lot of detail, a lot of scary detail. In particular, the poles have been heating up 4 to 5 times more rapidly than the rest of the planet. And of course that's important because that's where all the ice is, and melt that, and that has a direct impact on sea levels. So what's happening in Greenland and what's happening in Antarctica is particularly scary. Greenland ice loss is 7 times higher now than it was in the 1990s. Glaciers are shedding 400 billion tons of water every year, of ice rather, which is something like 400 cubic kilometers of ice, staggering amount. The melting rate is increasing exponentially. We're now seeing rain at the highest point on Greenland. We're seeing wildfires in the areas that are not covered with ice. And locked-in sea levels, in other words, sea levels that are definitely going to happen. A recent paper suggested it could be up to 78 centimetres locked in, and of course, if the whole lot went, we're talking about 7 centimetres. I'm just going to grab a drink of water. 7 metres, sorry. And there's a big question mark about what we call tipping points. A tipping point, of course, is where in the case of Greenland, where the ice starts to melt, and whatever we do in terms of reducing temperatures, it carries on melting. That tipping point for Greenland is expected to be at 1.5 degrees C global average temperature rise, or perhaps even lower. So we may have crossed that, which means we're committed, whatever we do, to a 7-metre rise. If we go to the other end of the planet, Antarctica is where most of the fresh water that's locked up in ice resides. If it all melted, we'd have a 58-metre sea level rise. I think that's something we'd probably all notice. The melting rate is 6 times what it was in the 1980s. From 2012 to 2017, the melting increased 3-fold. Now, if that continues, if that rate of increase in melting continues, then you're looking at sea level rise approaching 5 centimetres a year by the mid-2040s. Sea level now is rising at half a centimetre a year, and it looks as if it might be doubling every 20 years or so. So that would fit reasonably well with that. Just a single glacier in Antarctica, the Thwaites Glacier, sometimes known as the Doomsday Glacier, on its own would raise sea level by 65 centimetres, and that is really starting to move now and is causing enormous concern. That's a picture of it at the bottom left there. And the really worrying thing is that East Antarctica, which is this whole area here, this is West Antarctica on the left of the mountain range here. East Antarctica is seeing a lot of its big coastal glaciers starting to slide as well. And that was thought to be stable under almost any level of warming, but it looks now as if East Antarctica is starting to wake up. Now, it isn't just the direct effects of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases accumulating in the atmosphere that are a problem. Of course, that directly translates to heat and extreme weather, but it also causes other things to happen that you might not have expected. And I've just very briefly summarised 4 of these here. Sinks to sources. Carbon sinks soak up carbon, carbon sources produce it. What looks as if it's going to happen over coming decades is that many things that are sinks at the moment, like soils, like plants, like forests, like the oceans, will become sources. They'll start to produce carbon rather than soak it up. This has already started with the Amazon, which used to be a big soaker up, a big sink of carbon, and is now producing about 1 billion tonnes a year because of deforestation, intentional burning, and wildfires as the forest dries out. Methane burps, another unknown, if you like. There is something like 1.4 trillion tonnes of methane locked up in submarine permafrost at polar latitudes, and of course more under land as well. There's been concern that some of this could be released in huge burps of something like 50 billion tonnes a go. The consensus seems to be that this isn't likely, because if we look back at other times of global heating, we don't see evidence for these big methane burps. But an absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, so we really don't know. The key point is that methane is 86 times more effective at soaking up heat than carbon dioxide, so it is a worry. Then we have the Atlantic conveyors shut down, the Gulf Stream and associated currents, which carry warmth to the UK and Northern Europe, keeps our climate warmer than it otherwise would be in winter. This has now been described in a number of papers as being completely unstable. And in the IPCC reports, this was not thought to be an issue. It wasn't thought that this would shut down this century. But the situation now is far worse. It could slow dramatically, and it could in fact shut down quite easily before 2100. And there's evidence from the past that when it shuts down, it can do so in a matter of months. So the climate in Western Europe and in the UK and in Northern Europe could cool dramatically. Now, that isn't a good thing. The rest of the world will still carry on heating up, and in the end, global heating would continue to warm the UK and Europe. But it would have huge knock-on impacts on the global climate. It would also see a very rapid sea level rise along the eastern coast of North America as the currents grind to a halt and the water backs up. So there would be huge issues associated with that. And another sting in the tail, which I've called bouncing back here, is one that you may not have come across. And that is that climate breakdown, climate change also affects the solid Earth. This is the area that I tend to work most in. And what happens is if you lose a very large amount of ice, and in the case of Greenland we have something like 3 kilometres, any active faults underneath that will be rejuvenated. There'll have been accumulating stress, in the case of Greenland, for example, over hundreds of thousands of years, but they won't have had the opportunity to release the stress because of the weight of ice. So there is a potential, as Greenland melts, for major earthquakes to occur in Greenland and below Greenland. I have colleagues working on this who suggest this could happen within decades. Now, you might think, well, so what? There aren't many people living in Greenland. But we've seen exactly the same thing at the end of the last ice age in Scandinavia. And what happened there, something like 8,000 years ago, was that these big earthquakes, as the ice was lost, triggered submarine landslides, which generated tsunamis, which were 6 meters high when they hit the UK. Now, that is a scenario which is perfectly possible in the case of Greenland. We're seeing, at the moment, using GPS, we can see the whole of the North Atlantic is starting to rise up again as the ice melts and the weight of the ice is lost, all the way from Norway to Canada. So, this is a unusual and generally unknown aspect of climate breakdown, but it makes the point that it's not just the oceans and the atmosphere are involved. The solid Earth, the geosphere, also plays a part. Climate breakdown is a threat multiplier as well as causing these direct physical effects. In other words, things that we already have, it makes worse. Famine, war, health, mental illness, civil strife, etc. famine and food security are going to be a massive issue in the future. There's one statistic that comes from a Chatham House report a couple of years back, which suggests that by 2050, the world will need 50% more food, but crop yields could be 30% down as a result of climate breakdown and extreme weather. Now, that is a recipe for widespread famine, social unrest, and conflict. No country on the planet would be immune from that sort of devastating loss of calories, if you like. War. Well, one place where we're going to see conflict or potential conflict is the Arctic Ocean, where lots of countries are already turning their greedy eyes to oil deposits, gas deposits, minerals, etc. And that is a potential flashpoint for the future. But the one I'm most concerned about really is South and Southeast Asia. In the second half of this century, the main Southeast Asian rivers that flow into China, into India, into Pakistan, into Vietnam, etc., those rivers will be starting to fail. And at the moment, they provide water that helps to feed 2 billion people. So conflict between China and India, on one side, between India and Pakistan on the other, over water is a real possibility, almost a certainty. I mean, there's already considerable unrest all the way along those borders. And of course, what we don't want at the height of a growing climate crisis is saber rattling between 3 nuclear powers. So, that is not a pretty picture by any means. Health and mental illness is going to be a massive issue. Diseases will be spreading their range. We only got rid of mosquitoes after the war in the UK. They will almost certainly be back because we'll have temperatures and climates that will support that. Already in Europe, you have dengue fever, West Nile fever, etc. Mental illness is going to be a massive problem, partly because of the strain of living under the different conditions as the planet continues to warm, but also because infrastructure will be breaking down. There won't be the support for people with mental illness that we see today, such as it is. And civil strife, it's simply what you would expect to happen as the world struggles to feed itself and struggles to find water. It's just something that will happen inevitably. So societal breakdown is something that climate scientists never talk about, and most other people don't like to talk about, but it's something we have to address. I'll talk about this guy with the bow tie in a minute. Climate impacts, food and energy costs are already having a massive impact. We know that ourselves on cost of living, particularly in this country. Food shortages are predicted in the UK and France this winter due to the impact of climate breakdown on harvests. 19 million people are on the brink of famine, and in fact the United Nations says 345 million people are marching towards starvation at the moment. The Global Human Development Index, which ever since it was developed has been going up, started dropping 2 years ago and is expected to carry on dropping next year. So the metrics are getting worse for many countries, not just in the majority world either. I mean, it's staggering that in the United States, for example, the life expectancy now is down to 76 years, 76.1, and heading down. So this is affecting everyone. Climate breakdown will not lead to that going back up again. A new report came out last week which predicted that in more than half of the world's nations, including the UK and European countries, civil unrest could be expected within the next few months because of the problems with food and energy costs. So this is happening now in 2022. What's it going to be like in 2030 and beyond? That is the issue. The reason I've shown Alfred Henry Lewis here is because he was the person that made the famous quote that there are only 9 meals between mankind and anarchy. I suspect actually that there may be less than that. So where next for planet Earth? Well, this shows cold to hot, stability, time. This is the Earth at the end of the last glacial. We're heading down to the hotter end of the curve. We need to be going back up here. We need to reduce emissions so we stabilise our climate. But this is where we're heading at the moment. into hothouse conditions which are self-feeding. There was a report again out last week which said that if all the reserves of oil and gas are burnt and coal, we will produce 3.5 trillion tonnes of carbon dioxide. That's more than have been emitted since the Industrial Revolution. Now, if that actually happens, and you'd think, surely we can't be that stupid, but we know what the answer to that is. If that happens, then how high the global average temperature will get is anybody's guess. There was a seminal paper published in 2013 by James Hansen and others who predicted that if we burn all our reserves, fossil fuel reserves, then the global average temperature rise will be 16 degrees. Now, the planet at the moment is about 15 degrees centigrade on average. This would mean the average temperature was over 30 degrees C. That is uninhabitable across much of the planet for human beings. We simply couldn't live under those conditions. So that's the bottom line. That's when we're arguing about temperatures and about emissions, etc. This is what it comes down to. Are we going to end up by destroying our civilization and our world? And on that happy note, I'll stop. Thank you.
Well done. Right. For the longest time, scientists has been bought up by big corporations to kind of confuse the public, tell a couple of lies here and there to mislead. So can we give a round of applause to Professor McGuire and Anderson for telling the truth and not getting paid out, not taking the cash. Well done. Thank you, guys, honestly. I must also say, I'm not a big fan of you two. Because every time I hear the science part of any talk, I get a little bit overwhelmed, right? It's a bit too much for me to handle, because I feel like it's so big. Like, what do I do? And being born in a developing country and living in a developed country, I feel the guilt of both, right? The pull. Because my people are gonna feel this before we over here feel it. So sometimes I feel like it's a bit too much. So it's always great to have a person like our next speaker who takes it not from an overwhelming point of view and just like, oh, I'm giving up, and take it to what can we do together to make the difference. So give a warm welcome from Just Up All Jade. Woo! And get your tissues ready, because I cry every time we go.
Hello everyone. It's shit, isn't it? So you've had the bad news, and it's really bad. The emergency is with us. People are dying now. We got a very small taste in this country this year, didn't we, with our 40 degrees. Did you enjoy that? No. And it's going to get shittier, and the shittiness is going to come quicker and quicker. And I thought before recent months that it couldn't get much worse than that, but then we got a new Prime Minister who used to work for Shell, and we got a new Secretary of State for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy who thinks it's a good idea to extract every ounce of hydrocarbons from the North Sea, and whose hedge fund is heavily invested in fossil fuels. He's a known climate skeptic. So after COP26, when our former Prime Minister Boris Johnson said all the right things and said we were a global leader, 3 months after COP26, and you've heard how shit it is, he gave the go-ahead to a new oil field in the North Sea called Abigail. On the 1st of June, they gave the go-ahead to a gas field called Jackdaw. There were 40 new fossil fuel projects in the pipeline, and Just Up Oil was set up to fight that. Now we have a Prime Minister who's looking at 130 new fossil fuel projects, and they're hell-bent on it. They're lifting the moratorium on fracking. It's a free-for-all. So, are we going to let it happen? That's the question I'm asking you. as ordinary individual people, do we have power? Well, one of the great lies is that as individuals we don't have power. We're just individual atomised units of economic consumption, and our job is to consume and die. But that is a big lie, because if you look throughout human history, people have tremendous power when they come together and they act collectively. How did we get a weekend? How did we get paid holiday? How did we get paid sick leave? How did we get all the rights that we take for granted as workers? It was through ordinary working people coming together and taking collective action through trade unions. How did we get the right to roam? How did we get national parks? That was ordinary working people from Manchester, yay, and Derbyshire who did the mass trespass on Kinder Scout 90 years ago. It's the 90th anniversary this year. How did women get the vote? Well, loads of women said, it's shit that we can't vote, we want a say. So they came together and they caused a bit of disruption, and they wouldn't stop. And eventually, they got the vote. How did we get desegregation in the south of the USA through the civil rights movement? Black and white people coming together and sitting on buses. What a challenge. Black and white people sitting together. It wasn't allowed. And they did it peacefully and non-violently and persistently until they forced the desegregation of interstate travel in the USA. I could go on. There are just countless examples throughout human history of people taking collective action. The first thing is you have to come together in large numbers. The bigger numbers, the better. And I'm so excited there are so many of you in this room, because we need you. We need you. We need you. Big numbers of people coming together. Causing disruption. Putting pressure on the pinch points. Causing economic disruption. Causing disruption to the system so that the system can no longer cope and the government is forced to negotiate. And doing it non-violently. Because there's a whole social science behind this. We're not just licking a finger and sticking it in the air. Oh no. You've heard from the scientists, well, there's a huge body of social science behind this. There's proper research that shows that mass, non-violent civil disobedience works. It achieves people's objectives. And given the timescales that we're working on now, you've heard the science, you've heard how bad it is, you've heard that 2050 net zero, it's all rubbish. We have 2 to 3 years. We have 2 to 3 years to turn a corner, to force our government to see sense. Don't take it from me, Professor Sir David King, former chief scientist and climate advisor to the government, said last year we have 3 to 4 years to turn a corner, to determine the future of humanity. Sir David Attenborough, the collapse of human civilization is on the horizon unless we act now. Antonio Guterres, UN Secretary General, investing in new fossil fuels at this stage in human history is moral and economic madness. So we have to come together in large numbers. We have to disrupt, put pressure on the government, and we have to do it non-violently. And so, we can see with the climate change movement that this has worked. We actually have proof that it's worked in this country. Extinction Rebellion was formed, and a few years ago they blocked all the bridges in central London, and they brought everything to a standstill for quite a few days. And Michael Gove was on the phone saying, please, can we have a meeting? And the government, Parliament, declared a climate emergency. So not much has happened since then, but it's an example of how people just peacefully sitting down and stopping everything from moving can have an impact. And then we had Insulate Britain. Now they caused a lot of disruption, didn't they? And opinion was divided. Small group of people causing massive disruption. Got insulation discussed. Got 80% name recognition within 3 weeks. Roger Harrabin of the BBC said that they had achieved more in 3 weeks than he'd achieved in 30 years as environment correspondent for the BBC. People were talking about it. And guess what? We all wish our homes were better insulated, don't we, now with the energy prices? Yeah. And so we come on to Just Stop Oil. I've explained why we need to just stop oil. It's no new oil and gas. That is our demand. No new oil and gas. We're not going to turn off the tap straight away because the existing supplies will last for 8 years. And the good news is that we have the technology to move away from fossil fuels completely in that time. We have renewable energy, we have the technologies, and we are fortunate in this country. We've got wind, we've got a bit of sun, we've got tides, we're an island, we've got wave power. We could completely revolutionise our energy sector and rely completely on renewables within the next 8 years. What we lack is the political will. How do we get the political will? Mass non-violent civil disobedience. And that's why we're having meetings like this. Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of meetings are taking place up and down the country, and ordinary people like you and me are coming together and deciding that we've had enough. So Just Stop Oil took action in April, and we stopped 53% of the oil supply for 2 weeks in this country, but we did not have enough people to keep it going. So now we're recruiting so that we get enough people to keep it going for as long as it takes to tell Liz Truss, no, you're not doing that. We've had enough. And we are in coalition with lots of other groups who are working on the cost of living crisis and all the other impacts on people that our toxic system has. And we're all coming together to occupy Westminster from the 1st of October. There are coaches going from cities around the country. There are 2 coaches going from Manchester. No excuse, book your place. On the 1st of October, you can go down, you can have a taste of it, you can go on a march, you can sit in the road, you can get on the coach back home. That's one option. Or you can join us and jump in, because we are going to hold central London, and each region of the country has got teams of people who are going to block and cause disruption every single day throughout October and for as long as it takes. I can tell you now what the dates for the North are. October the 4th, get your pens out. October the 4th, the 11th, the 13th, to 27th and the 29th of October, and into November if necessary. If you join us, you will get full training, full support. You will be put in a local team with people that you develop a firm bond and a strong relationship with. There is lots of legal advice, there is lots of well-being support. We are a community and we support one another. And we can do this thing. And I know that there'll be people in the audience thinking, yes, but I'm not the kind of person that does that kind of thing, Jane. Well, if not you, who? Because it's now or never time. This is our last and best hope. You've heard the science. I was sitting there like you, this time last year. I was a civil servanty type working for the Office of the Parliamentary and Health Service Ombudsman. I thought, I can't do it. I'm registered blind, I've got no central vision. Yeah, that shocked you, didn't it? Yeah. I'm registered blind, I've got to keep my job, and if I get arrested and I'm convicted, that's gross misconduct and I'll be out of a job. And I have caring responsibilities, so nah, not for me. But where there is a will, there is a way. I was arrested with my team in April, and you cannot stereotype the people who are in Just Stop Oil. Don't listen to the newspapers. There was a retired vicar, there was a doctor's wife, there was a forklift truck driver, the owner of a small accountancy firm, 2 charity workers, me, the civil servancy type, a grandma from Liverpool, who else have we got? Oh yeah, a serving county councillor. And when I sat on a road in August and got arrested, down in Essex, blocking the road to an oil terminal, guess who was in the road? There was a woman who was a retired Justice of the Peace. She'd had a double hip replacement. She had one of those fisherman's chairs, you know. Another retired vicar, you know, the Christians, they're the shock troops, you know. They're out there with their moral crusade. Yeah? A former local councillor. Someone with Parkinson's. And me, the blindy. Yeah, so age is no barrier. In April, a 96-year-old sat in the road, and the youngest person to take action was 15. Disability, no barrier. We've got a woman signed up who uses a mobility scooter. I'm looking forward to see how the police deal with that. Yeah? And if you're thinking, well, I can't because of my career, you've heard the science. What is your future going to be like? Are you going to have a career? Am I going to have a pension? The collapse of human civilization is on the horizon. It's happening now. Climate breakdown is happening now. So, if you really can't get arrested, and we'd love you to, and it's not as bad as you think, and if you want to talk about it, come and speak to, there's loads of us who've been arrested in this room. You'll get to know who they are later on. So it's not as bad as you think, and the consequences may not be as bad as you think, because the police have been cut and there's been austerity for 10 years, and the CPS is on its knees, and the whole criminal justice system is just in tatters. So, you know, yeah, we have to bear that in mind. So if you can't get arrested, there are support roles. We need drivers, we need people to be in the houses where people are when they're taking action, cook lovely food, be nice, be available, make sure the fridge is stocked. We need people to wait outside police stations when people are released. There are lots of back office admin type roles. We also need people to help us organise meetings, leaflet for meetings, fly post for meetings. Oh, bit dodgy that. Yeah? So there's loads and loads and loads and loads of things that you can do. And we also need your money. So what people are doing actually is they're donating every month what they would earn in an hour. And that regular income keeps us going and making sure that we can keep the pressure on Liz Truss. So if you can't do anything else, give us your money. Okay, so that's enough from me. We're going to go into small groups. Please don't leave. We're not that scary. We're lovely people and we want to hear what you think. Thank you.
Right, okay. That was inspirational as per always, Jane. The next speaker is a supporter, just up was supporter, and she was just like you, and then she has done a lot of things. She's a bit nervous, so give her a lot of love. Give a round of applause to Lucy! Hello everyone. Yeah, I'm absolutely breaking it. Never done this before, so bear with me. Right, I just want to say thank you, Jane, for letting me talk, letting me do my personal story. Even though I am already involved in Just Stop Oil, I come to these talks still all the time because I learn new stuff every time I come and meet new amazing people. Other climate groups are terrific, but I personally have found the approach and the culture in JSO to be a perfect fit for me, what I can do. So for me, the last year has been a real learning curve, not just about the climate crisis, but myself as a person, who I was and who I am now, and what true happiness and fulfilment is. I was in what I now know is called soft denial. So I cared a bit, I guess, and that seems really weird now because a lot of my thoughts, waking thoughts, are about JSO and the lovely people I've met and about the climate crisis, because that's what it is, it's a crisis. And just caring a bit about it doesn't mean anything. It's completely worthless. It just makes us all complicit in what's going on. We care about material things, don't we? TV, holidays, having fun, and there's nothing wrong with that. I still do. Humans essentially want to be happy, and why not? We deserve to be happy, most of us. But I have feelings of fulfilment, focus and drive that I've never really experienced before. Our fellow human beings are suffering all over the world, aren't they? And a lot of them are the most vulnerable and they can't challenge the system, but we can. A lot of them don't have a voice, but we do. I've always thought, since I was little, that this planet is exciting, incredible, terrifying, enchanting and beautiful. And I still believe that. It is broken in many ways, we all know that. But I still believe that it's worth saving. And I believe that the way to do this is by direct action. Civil disobedience, basically being a total and utter nuisance to the government until they can't ignore us anymore. This has worked many times in history. I have a brilliant quote from Gandhi, my current favourite quote, and it's about non-violent activism. First they ignore you, then they laugh at you, then they fight you, then you win. Last bit. So that's my journey so far. When you become an activist, there's no going back, and I definitely never ever want to go back. If you agree with us, please don't just agree. Agree and join us and be on the right side of history with us. That's it.
How great was that? Our last speaker, Alex, he's the reason actually why I'm here. Because a couple of months ago, my partner and I were gonna go, we're giving up everything, the apartment in Manchester, and we were gonna go in a van to the Swiss Alps, living the dream. And then we got a leaflet from Alex. And now she's in prison, and I'm here. So this is great. Round of applause for Alex!
Hi there, I'm Alex, I'm 24 years old and I'm doing my PhD in green hydrogen production as a green fuel. And I actually went to a talk like this in mid-March, quite similar, a lot less people of course. And just 2 weeks later, I ran in front of a moving oil tanker. And I sat down on the road for 14 hours, glued myself to a friend, and I waited to get arrested. Since then, I've taken 7 months out of that very relevant PhD, and I've been arrested 4 times, and I don't regret a single second of it. Because from that, see, I learned 2 really important things from the talk I went to. One is that what we do as scientists means nothing if the government's not willing to implement it. You see, we're facing a form of genocide within our lifetimes. The fossil fuel companies are willing to do all of the horrible things that they're doing when they know full well that renewable energies have been cheaper for the last 2 years, much faster to implement, better for public optics, safer, all of these reasons, and they're still burning fossil fuels instead. They're committing a form of genocide on younger generations and on people in the global south. Because you see, our actions are very disproportionately affecting them. And when they try and protest, when they try and speak out for all the horrible things that are going on there, 33 million people in Pakistan have been displaced. I'm from Scotland, that's 6 times the population of my country has been displaced. And just a few months ago, it was so hot in Pakistan that birds fell out of the sky and littered the pavement. I know nothing more apocalyptic than that. And yet when they try and protest, they risk getting shot. If all I have to do to try and prevent global starvation within a decade is to sit in front of an oil tanker and wait to get arrested, then I'm going to do that. And so should all of you. That was the first thing I learned from the talk. The second thing I learned was that we are not powerless. As Jane said, a small number of people can make an extraordinary amount of difference. When we blocked, what was it, 53% of all oil in England, that was 400, 450 people doing that. That was it. In this room, there's about 150, 200 people. You could block 25% of all oil in the country right now. Because in all honesty, if you sit outside an oil terminal and refuse to leave, what is the police going to do? There's not enough jail cells outside of London that could contain all of you. When we did that in April, 450 people. Now we're in the thousands. We are no longer a small group. And when we come to Westminster on October 1st, we're going to be in the tens of thousands. We have so many coalitions partners, it's going to be fantastic. It's going to be, hopefully, the biggest mass activism event in UK history. The entire month of October, we're going to try and shut down London. How is that not the most exciting thing you've ever heard? We're at the point now where by January, 2/3 of the population of the UK could be in fuel poverty. In just 4 months, 2/3 of the entire population are in poverty because they can't pay their energy bills. Meanwhile, Shell, BP, £7 billion, a quarter in pure profit. The government still subsidises them, despite the head of BP saying they have more money than they know what to do with. The government still subsidise them with £236 million a week. A week. We can't pay our energy bills and they get that per week. Look, not everybody is going to do activism. And not everybody can be arrested. I fully appreciate that. As a straight white male, I thankfully had a really good experience in the cell and it wasn't too bad. But not everybody can get arrested, and I get that. But there are so many other ways that you can be involved. We don't need everybody. We need you guys. This is such a crucial moment in history. And never forget that we're not just fighting to reduce emissions. We're fighting to overcome a lot of systemic issues, income inequality, racism, all of these other things. We're fighting for a better world. And if that's not worth putting your body, your money, your time on the line for, then I don't know what is. Let's say an example. Let's say it's 1955. You're sat on a bus in the US, and there's someone telling a black woman, let's call her Rosa Parks for example, someone telling a black woman to get off the bus, to move. Are you going to be one of those people who are on that bus and didn't say anything? Or are you going to be that part of that crucial moment in history? Tell your kids that you did something amazing. Because that's what we need. As Jane said, if not you, who? If not now, when? I'll see you all on October 1st.
Thank you very much. Another big round of applause for Alex, please.